So I've recently been captivated by a series of photographs by American photographer Justine Kurland taken between 1997 and 2002. Her photo series, titled simply Girl Pictures, has been a source of fantasy escapism and inspiration to me during this isolating time. So today I want to talk about why her photos have had such an impact on me and why I think she's been able to capture a sentiment and desire that a lot of young women are experiencing in a way that aesthetically connects with us. I actually found her photos while on Pinterest when I was sad and lonely and putting together a board full of life, connection, and energy, which was super healthy. I ended up saving several photos from the series before I realized they were made by the same photographer, at which point I aggressively sought out as many of the images from the series as I could. The photos were taken on road trips across America that Justine started doing during her time at grad school. The subjects, a changing cast of young women, were recruited along the way. The images tell the story of teenage girls who are runaways, living in the periphery of American life, somewhat wild and yet still in ways dystopically connected to humanity through roadways, drain pipes, overpasses, buildings, and cars. While it becomes obvious that the images are constructed, at first glance, many of them show a sort of energy one typically associates with candid and street photography. This is what drew me to them initially. During the COVID pandemic, I've been feeling particularly trapped and isolated, so the feeling of freedom is alluring now more than ever. There's also a sense of sisterhood that pervades the series of images. Rarely do you find a girl alone. Instead, they're often photographed in packs, bathing, foraging, lounging, playing, or torturing boys. It's the opposite of our collective existence in 2020 and 2021, and therefore all the more seductive. I'll touch on this more in a little bit, but first I want to talk about the construction of the images themselves and why I think visually they're so interesting. The series as a whole feels nostalgic, and perhaps a part of that is to do with the 2000s attire and film photography aesthetic, but I would argue that it's actually much more to do with the way the images seem to reference many different movements and artists. The first, most glaringly obvious to myself, is the spirited tableaus reminiscent of Rococo art, and specifically the Fête Galante. This movement in art originated in France in the early 18th century and depicted bourgeoisie youth at play in parks and nature, rendered in pastel colors. There's a freedom and energy associated with these works that I think directly translate to Justine's images. The Rococo period was also a loose inspiration for the Impressionists later, and we see in their work depictions of the newly emerging middle class enjoying leisure time. These too have a sort of candid yet posed style that gives the impression of a lively moment being captured, in part due to the advent of the camera and also the desire to capture the fast-paced lifestyle of the Industrial Revolution. Justine's work seems to harken back to this style too in some of her images that chronicle a sort of moment in time. She opts for a soft, painterly light rather than strong midday sun, usually shooting on overcast days or in the morning or late afternoon, giving the images a sort of glow. Justine herself has also cited Arthur Rackham, an English illustrator known for his depictions of fairy tales, as a source of inspiration. His work often features characters in layered frames and many times confronted with the natural world. The illustrations are extremely emotive and complex. There's a whimsy to his images that I think comes across in some of the girl pictures, and a sort of dark romance to some of the settings and characters. There's also certain pictures in the series that conjure specific paintings or images, with the most obvious being Justine's The Bathers, which allude to a history of paintings under the same name, such as Cezanne's The Large Bathers or Renoir's The Bathers and Les Grandes Bagneuses. Others seem straight out of an Andrew Wyeth painting. The images are almost cinematic in nature, crafting a sort of narrative in each frame. This was something that was being explored and becoming popularized in the photography of the 90s and early 2000s, with photographers like Jeff Wall and Gregory Crewdson, who she studied under at Yale. Crewdson's images favor wide, horizontal frames and design lighting setups reminiscent of a still from a Hollywood film. His photos invite the imagination to create a story around the single frame, which are emotive, layered, and visually interesting. While some of the girl pictures feel similarly constructed in their narrative goals, I would argue that Justine pushes it a step further in many of them by concealing the construction behind action. The movement in her images, in conjunction with the soft, natural light, gives the illusion of something much more real. I believe that by concealing the construction, she's able to pull us deeper into the story of her world and into her characters' lives. It becomes less cerebral and more emotional. Our society has been reaching for nostalgia as a sort of comfort in a rapidly changing, anxiety-inducing, and isolating time. It's oftentimes easier to look at the past, whether that be media or our own personal memories, than to constantly be confronted by our present, especially for white people where the past was so favorable to us. If I were to have one critique of the photo series, it would be how limited the cast of characters Justine employs is, with hardly any people of color included. If Justine is presenting a utopic feminist alternative to the American existence, it excludes marginalized people from that fantasy. That being said, I do want to talk about the feminist, albeit white feminist, approach to the series. Boys rarely show up in the images, with only 2 exceptions that I've found. Both of the images, including boys, are titled Boy Torture. There's something extremely powerful seeing uninhibited female rebellion in media that has largely been reserved for men. The narrative elements of the series are reminiscent of Lord of the Flies or The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, but now reimagined through a female gaze. Rarely do we get to see girls as runaways, and rarer still do they get a happy ending. Part of the series includes schoolgirls in New Zealand, which reminded me of the Dead Poets Society. Sisterhood is something that seems to only now be becoming a priority in storytelling and media, where we have had brotherhood stories of soldiers, scholars, and criminals being explored extensively throughout history. There's something profoundly liberating and inspiring seeing young women in these roles, especially in such idyllic landscapes and being captured with such tenderness. We're starting to see more narratives, especially I think in the coming-of-age genre, that are exploring stories that were once dominated by male perspectives and storytellers. But now they're explored through the female gaze. Films like Booksmart, Lady Bird, and Girlhood explore female rebellion and intense complex friendships between girls. I think this aesthetic and narrative are something that is now becoming more mainstream. We see photographers like Olivia Bee and Petra Collins rise to prominence, exploring the complex lives, emotions, and rebellions of young women. This rising aesthetic is often paired with pastel and subdued colors and photographed on film. Even if they aren't directly inspired by Justine and the world she created in her Girl Pictures series, I think she opened the door to an exploration of female defiance and dissent rarely seen before. I think the series seems to work so well as it reaches artistically and narratively back to timeless conventions, while simultaneously reaching forwards towards a more inclusive and authentic future. But that is all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this look at Justine's work and that you enjoyed the series as much as I did. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the series in the comment section down below, especially if you've not seen it before, or even if you have. But I know this is a bit of a different style of video for me, so if you did enjoy that as well, I'd love to hear whether you'd like to see me do something like this again in the future, or if this is not something that interests you. I guess I'd like to hear that as well. But that's it, you know. Thumbs up, subscribe if you want, and I will see you next time.